Have you ever looked into someone's eyes, someone you trusted, only to find betrayal instead of compassion? A cold silence where love used to live. That moment stays with you, doesn't it? Not just because of what happened, but because of what it reveals. Not just about them, but about us. About the human mind, about you. The question arises, not from philosophy textbooks, but from the brutal tension of real life. Why do people hurt others, even those they claim to care about? This is not a question reserved for war criminals, for psychopaths, or for sociopaths operating in the shadows. It is a question that sits uncomfortably in the center of ordinary lives, in the hallway of a home, in the break room at work, in the anonymous sprawl of a social media feed. This is the domain of dark psychology, the unspoken forces that drive people to manipulate, to harm, to destroy. And yes, we like to believe that cruelty is rare, that it belongs to broken people or historical monsters. But the dark psychology of cruelty is more universal than that. The science doesn't lie. Studies from Stanford to Yale have shown repeatedly that ordinary individuals under the right conditions are capable of terrifying acts, not because they are evil, but because they are human. So let us ask the uncomfortable question together. Is there a part of you deep beneath your civilized skin that could be cruel too? In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted what would become one of the most infamous studies in the history of psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Volunteers were randomly assigned the roles of guards and prisoners in a simulated prison environment. Within just a few days, the so-called guards, ordinary young men with no history of aggression, began to humiliate, abuse, and psychologically torment their prisoners. The experiment had to be stopped prematurely. It didn't just unveil the psychology of cruelty, it exposed something darker, a mirror that reflects something dormant in all of us. This wasn't about sadism for its own sake. It was about obedience, about power, about the seductive grip of roles and identities. It was a lesson in moral disengagement, a term coined by Bandura, describing the cognitive process that allows individuals to commit inhumane acts while justifying them internally. The participants believed they were merely doing what was expected of them, and that belief gave them permission to harm. This is the entry point into the real dark psychology of human behavior. Not only what we do, but what we are capable of believing in order to do it. Behind every act of cruelty is not just a decision, but a justification, a narrative, a lie wrapped in truth, or worse, a truth buried in lies. In a world obsessed with kindness and image, how do we explain the online trolling, the subtle bullying in schools, the emotional violence in relationships? Why do people who seem empathetic still gossip, sabotage, and dismiss others as if they were objects? Could it be that cruelty, like kindness, is a choice we make far more often than we admit? Cruelty thrives in moments when people feel powerless, unheard, or invisible. It emerges when control is lost, or when fear replaces reason. And most disturbingly, it often wears a mask of righteousness, a mask of justice, even a mask of love. This isn't about blaming, this is about understanding. The lens of dark psychology gives us a framework to see beyond surface behavior, to uncover the shadow patterns hiding in our culture and relationships. If you've ever been hurt by someone close to you, or found yourself doing or saying things you didn't recognize, this isn't a failure of character. This is the pull of something deeper, something that must be studied, not denied. Because the moment you admit that cruelty is not foreign but familiar, that's the moment it begins to lose its power. So ask yourself, what have you justified recently, in silence, that you wouldn't dare say out loud? We do not begin with cruelty, we begin with survival. Long before civilization carved laws into stone, long before morality was printed in books, there was only the instinct to endure, eat, reproduce, protect, and sometimes to harm, not out of malice, but necessity. In this ancient world, cruelty was not evil, it was effective. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology, aggression developed as an adaptive trait. It ensured access to resources, safety from predators, and control over mating opportunities. A human who could defend their territory or seize another's was more likely to pass on their genes. Over millennia, that instinct became woven into our nervous systems. We are quite literally wired for conflict. But this isn't the whole story. We're not just violent by design, we're social, cooperative, empathetic. The same species that made war also made families, rituals, and music. How then do these opposing forces coexist? Konrad Lorenz, a Nobel Prize-winning ethologist, argued that aggression is not limitless. In animals, it has built-in release valves, rituals, submission gestures, boundaries. But human beings, with their complex brains and layered societies, can bypass those natural breaks. With weapons and ideologies, with language and lies, we can escalate far beyond instinct. We can turn aggression into cruelty, not just injury, but intentional pain. This is where dark psychology emerges, not in the mere act of fighting, but in the cold calculation behind it. Unlike other species, we don't just react, we plan, we target, we remember. If you think about your own life, when have you felt the desire to strike back? Not just for protection, but to make someone feel what you felt. That desire doesn't come from a primal scream, it comes from a rational voice. It whispers reasons, it collects evidence, it wears the mask of justice, but it stinks of vengeance. The dark psychology of cruelty lies in this transition, from reactive survival to strategic harm, from nature to narrative. We tell ourselves stories about why someone deserves pain. We create roles, victim, hero, villain, to justify our response. And sometimes, these stories are built on real suffering, but sometimes they're built on fear. Fear of weakness, fear of betrayal, fear that if we do not hurt first, we will be hurt. In tribal societies, aggression was directed outward to protect the in-group. But in modern life, those lines blur. The enemy isn't always outside the wall. Sometimes it's across the dinner table. Sometimes it's in the mirror. You may ask, why would evolution favor such destructive behavior within our own kind? Because cruelty, paradoxically, can signal power. In social hierarchies, those who dominate others are often seen, at least temporarily, as strong. In primate studies, alpha individuals often maintain control through a mix of fear and favor. The same can be said for certain leaders, bullies, and even online influencers who weaponize humiliation to maintain status. In a world flooded with voices, cruelty becomes a loudspeaker, but it comes at a cost. Studies in neuroscience show that chronic aggression rewires the brain, especially in regions responsible for empathy and impulse control. People who repeatedly inflict harm become desensitized to suffering. Their pain threshold for others increases. In extreme cases, this leads to emotional detachment and traits aligned with antisocial behavior. Have you ever witnessed someone act with cold, calculated indifference and felt the chill of it, as if they were already gone? This is not just a matter of choice, it's biology. Repeated cruelty can reshape the brain itself. That's the terrifying truth of the psychology of cruelty. It feeds itself, and it evolves, just like we did. Yet, none of this means we are destined to be cruel. If evolution gave us aggression, it also gave us imagination. We can foresee consequences, we can reflect, we can choose, but only if we recognize the instincts inside us. Cruelty is not a mistake, it is part of our programming, but understanding that program, where it came from, how it operates, is the first step to rewriting it. And if you pause, just for a moment, and wonder how often you've used pain to feel powerful, you've already started. Cruelty rarely announces itself with a clear purpose. It often comes disguised, wrapped in sarcasm, cloaked in self-righteousness, or justified as just being honest. But beneath these polished surfaces, something quieter often hides: insecurity, powerlessness, shame. The most dangerous cruelty is not committed in chaos, it is executed in control. That control, however, is often an illusion, an armor forged by the fragile ego. And this is where dark psychology operates most intimately, not in violence alone, but in the human need to hide our deepest fears behind dominance. Sigmund Freud's model of defense mechanisms provides a valuable lens. Take projection, for instance. A person who feels envy may accuse others of being envious. Someone ashamed of weakness might bully those perceived as weak. This form of psychological maneuvering is not random, it is protective, and when fear grows sharp, protection can turn predatory. Have you ever belittled someone, not because they did anything wrong, but because they reminded you of something you didn't want to admit about yourself. In that moment, cruelty becomes camouflage, a way to bury vulnerability under performance, to cover fear with aggression, to smother doubt with control. This is the essence of the dark psychology of cruelty, a mirror of the psyche turned outward. When the ego feels threatened, it lashes out, not to hurt for hurt's sake, but to silence the discomfort it cannot face. And when that pain is masked by confidence or cleverness, the cruelty becomes harder to see, both for others and for ourselves. Modern studies in behavioral psychology show that those who score high on narcissistic behavior or Machiavellianism, traits within the so-called dark triad, often engage in subtle forms of harm, manipulation, deception, emotional distancing. These people do not always shout or strike. They control with charm, withholding, and calculated coldness. And sometimes they rise to positions of influence, not despite these traits, but because of them. But let's bring this closer to home. In relationships, cruelty often begins small. The rolling eyes, the passive-aggressive comment, the withheld affection. It escalates not because someone wakes up wanting to destroy, but because they feel unheard, unseen, or worse, helpless. And so they reach for the only power they believe they have left, the power to wound. How many times have you said something meant to hurt, only because you were desperate to feel in control? This is not uncommon. Research from the American Psychological Association suggests that emotional cruelty often correlates with perceived loss of status or identity. In simpler terms, people lash out when they feel like they're disappearing. Cruelty becomes a loud, ugly cry for recognition. And in the digital age, where attention is currency, this hunger for recognition can breed its own monsters. Online cruelty thrives not only because of anonymity, but because cruelty gets reactions. It disrupts, it asserts presence. Even a hateful comment makes someone visible. Invisibility for many is worse. Now consider the psychology of cruelty as an addictive feedback loop. Each time a cruel action results in perceived control of a partner, a peer, an audience, it reinforces itself. Like any addictive pattern, it promises relief, but delivers corrosion. Over time, the person no longer acts out of fear, they act out of habit. Their cruelty no longer hides insecurity, it becomes identity. But this identity is brittle. It cannot tolerate introspection. It avoids silence, because in silence, the ego hears what it tried to forget. And so we must ask, what are you protecting when you hurt others? Is it your pride, your dignity, or something even more delicate? Understanding this aspect of dark psychology doesn't excuse cruelty, but it reveals the mechanism behind it. We harm when we feel we have no other way to be heard. We manipulate when we believe the truth will not protect us. We control when we feel unsafe. If cruelty is a mask, then maybe healing begins when we no longer need to wear it. There is a peculiar comfort in believing that cruelty is always a personal failing, that those who hurt others must be broken, twisted, or evil at their core. But what if the truth is more unsettling? What if cruelty is in part the result of something far more ordinary, obedience? In the 1960s, social psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a now famous experiment at Yale University. Participants were instructed to administer what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to another person, simply because an authority figure told them to. The shocks were fake, the screams were scripted, but the participants didn't know that. The results were staggering. Over 60% of people continued administering shocks, even after hearing cries of pain and pleas to stop. Not because they were sadists, not because they hated the victim, but because someone in a lab coat said, "You must continue." This was dark psychology in action, ordinary individuals participating in acts of cruelty, not out of hatred, but submission. This finding disrupted our understanding of morality. It suggested that the line between decency and destruction could be as thin as a uniform, a clipboard, or a calm voice of authority. Have you ever followed orders that didn't sit right in your gut, simply because it felt easier than saying no? Milgram's work was followed by another classic study, the Conformity experiment. Participants were asked to match line lengths in a group setting. When confederates in the group deliberately chose the wrong answer, the real participant often conformed, even when the answer was obviously incorrect. The desire to fit in overrode their perception of reality. This is how conformity sets the stage for cruelty. It tells us, stay quiet, don't question, everyone else agrees, why don't you? When these forces, obedience and conformity, combine, cruelty becomes a collective behavior. This is how entire institutions, governments, even communities carry out abuse without resistance. Dark psychology of cruelty doesn't need monsters, it only needs structure, silence, and repetition. But there's more. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment, which we've mentioned earlier, confirmed the same pattern. When given roles of power and a context that justified cruelty, people fell into brutality with startling ease. These weren't outliers, they were students, sons, friends, people like you. You may think, but I would never go that far. And perhaps you wouldn't. But the power of moral disengagement, Bandura's concept again, shows us how easy it is to reframe cruelty as necessity. We shift language, we label others as deserving, we remove their face, their story, their voice. This is especially true in modern environments, like online spaces. When someone becomes just a username, an avatar, or a political label, it becomes easier to ridicule, dehumanize, or dismiss them entirely. And when that behavior is mirrored and validated by a group, it grows. The psychology of cruelty becomes embedded in digital culture, not fringe but mainstream. Have you ever laughed at a cruel meme, only to feel uneasy afterward? That hesitation is important. It means your conscience still recognizes the cost. But not everyone stops. Some adapt, some numb themselves. The bystander effect, another social psychological phenomenon, adds another layer. When responsibility is diffused across many people, individuals are less likely to intervene. This allows cruelty not just to happen, but to spread unchecked. Inaction becomes complicity. And this raises a difficult question. In a world that rewards compliance and punishes resistance, how often do you trade your conscience for comfort? The dark psychology revealed by these experiments is not about blaming society, it's about recognizing the quiet pressures that shape our actions. Pressures that whisper, don't speak up, don't make it awkward, just follow along. But history shows us that silence empowers harm, and that true strength lies not in obedience, but in awareness. There is a chilling truth at the heart of many atrocities. They are not committed by monsters. They are carried out by people who look like neighbors, who speak softly, who fill out forms, wear glasses, go home to families. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil, the unsettling idea that horrific acts are often performed not by sadists but by ordinary individuals doing their jobs, following orders and avoiding moral responsibility. In 1961, Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem. He was one of the architects of the Holocaust, responsible for organizing the logistics that led millions to death camps. But during his trial, what struck observers most was not his hatred, it was his normality. Eichmann did not appear like a villain. He appeared bureaucratic, detached, even dull. This observation gave rise to Arendt's provocative thesis: evil does not always stem from ideology or hatred. Sometimes it stems from thoughtlessness, from a failure to reflect, from a desire to blend in, not to stand out. This is the silent engine behind the psychology of cruelty in large systems. Have you ever witnessed someone being mistreated and said nothing, not because you agreed, but because you didn't want to be the one to intervene? That moment of hesitation is familiar. It is not evil, but it can be dangerous, because cruelty thrives in passive spaces. When no one stops it, it grows, and when it grows unchecked, it becomes normalized. This is the core of the bystander effect, a phenomenon first studied after the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York City. Reports at the time suggested that dozens of people heard her screams, yet no one called the police. Later investigations revealed the story had been exaggerated, but the psychological insight remained. When many people witness harm, each person feels less responsible to act. The diffusion of responsibility leads to moral paralysis. We assume someone else will step in, but often no one does. In social psychology, this is compounded by pluralistic ignorance, the idea that individuals in a group wrongly believe their own private doubts are unique. If everyone else seems unbothered, we stay silent, even when we feel something is wrong. Now imagine this, multiplied across cities, institutions, governments. Cruelty becomes invisible, not because it hides, but because it becomes part of the furniture. The dark psychology behind this is not rooted in ideology, it's rooted in habits of disengagement. We learn to look away, to laugh it off, to mind our own business, and in doing so, we become part of the mechanism. What makes this more disturbing is how easily language helps the process. Victims are renamed: criminal, terrorist, threat, other. Once someone is labeled as less than, the moral restraint loosens. This is called dehumanization, and it's one of the most dangerous psychological tools in the architecture of cruelty. Studies from the University of Kent found that people are more likely to justify harm when victims are perceived as less human, when they are compared to animals, or described in abstract terms. The same principle has been used in propaganda, political speech, even everyday gossip. A person becomes just another problem, instead of a story worth listening to. And what about online culture? Digital platforms often encourage detachment. When cruelty becomes content, the line between expression and violence blurs. We scroll past suffering, not because we don't care, but because we see too much. The result is emotional desensitization. Have you ever paused at a tragic headline, felt something twist inside you, and then kept scrolling anyway? That numbness is not your fault, but it is your responsibility, because each act of cruelty, whether systemic or personal, survives on the same oxygen: silence, indifference, forgetting. Understanding the dark psychology of cruelty means acknowledging how easily you too could become a bystander, not because you wish to harm, but because you wish to avoid discomfort. But moral courage begins in discomfort. It begins when you stop and say, "This isn't okay," even when no one else does. If you've ever hurt someone and regretted it later, you are not alone. Most people at some point inflict pain, whether emotional, psychological, or physical, on someone they care about. And more often than not, they don't do it because they are evil. They do it because they are convinced they are right. This is one of the most insidious dynamics in the dark psychology of everyday life: the transformation of good intentions into harmful actions, the quiet slide from moral confidence to moral blindness. The concept of cognitive dissonance, introduced by psychologist Leon Festinger, helps explain this. When our actions contradict our values, we experience psychological discomfort. To ease that discomfort, we often adjust our beliefs rather than our behavior. We tell ourselves stories, we justify, we minimize, we say things like "they deserved it," or "I had no choice," or "it was for their own good." Have you ever told yourself a lie, just convincing enough to let you sleep at night? That lie is the first layer of self-deception, and it's often the beginning of cruelty, wrapped in virtue. Moral licensing plays a similar role. After doing something we perceive as good, being generous, working hard, staying loyal, we sometimes feel we've earned the right to slip, to cut corners, to snap, to hurt, not because we think it's okay, but because we believe we've built up credit in our moral account. This becomes even more complicated when social identity is involved. People who strongly identify with a group, political, religious, professional, may commit or support harmful actions against outsiders, believing it serves a greater good. This tribal loyalty can lead to what psychologists call moral disengagement, a cognitive process that enables cruelty by framing it as necessary. This is a recurring theme in the psychology of cruelty, the way self-perception shapes behavior. The more we see ourselves as good, the more likely we are to overlook the harm we cause, because admitting cruelty would mean admitting we are not who we thought we were. And that is painful. Carl Jung referred to this hidden part of the psyche as the shadow, the unconscious aspects of ourselves that we reject, deny, or disown, the parts we pretend don't exist. But when the shadow remains unacknowledged, it doesn't disappear, it acts out, sometimes quietly, sometimes destructively. Have you ever caught yourself saying something so cutting, so out of character, you didn't recognize your own voice? That voice may come from your shadow, a part of you that felt ignored, pushed aside, and in a moment of vulnerability, it found its way out, through sarcasm, through silence, or through cruelty. The dark psychology of cruelty doesn't always scream, sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior. It means understanding where it begins and how it hides. Good people do bad things, not because they lack conscience, but because they've trained themselves not to listen to it in certain moments. Add to that the influence of stress, trauma, and emotional fatigue, and you have a perfect storm. When we are overwhelmed, our ability to self-regulate diminishes. Our empathy narrows. We operate in survival mode, and in survival mode, kindness feels like a luxury. This is how cruelty can become habit, not because we are broken, but because we are hurting. So ask yourself, when was the last time you felt proud of something that caused someone else pain? And did you notice, or did you move on quickly, before the guilt could rise? Self-awareness is not a punishment, it is protection. It is the antidote to blind harm. And perhaps the first step toward healing the cycle is this: learning to sit with discomfort, to pause before you act, to question the story you're telling yourself in the heat of the moment. Because sometimes the cruelest lie is the one we tell ourselves, that we had no other choice. If cruelty is a wound we inflict, healing begins, not with punishment, but with understanding. And yet many people fear understanding cruelty. They worry that to understand it is to excuse it. But the truth is the opposite. The better we understand cruelty, the reasons, the roots, the mechanisms, the more power we have to stop it. The first step in that understanding is awareness, not of others, but of yourself. Dark psychology does not thrive in conscious reflection. It operates in the dark corners of denial and reaction. But when light enters, when we name what we feel, when we pause instead of react, something changes. We begin to see cruelty not just as an action, but as a signal, a flare from somewhere deeper. This is why psychologists and trauma experts emphasize the importance of emotional regulation. Research shows that people with higher self-awareness and emotional vocabulary are less likely to engage in reactive aggression. They may still feel anger, fear, or pain, but they are less likely to weaponize those feelings. Ask yourself now, when did you last feel hurt? And what did you do with that pain? Did you express it, or did you pass it on? The work of compassion begins here, not with grand gestures, but with small, honest admissions. I'm angry, I'm scared, I feel invisible. These statements are not signs of weakness, they are signs of strength, because they interrupt the cycle. Compassion, however, is not always soft. Sometimes it is fierce. It holds people accountable without dehumanizing them. It refuses to let pain justify harm. This is what shadow psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, helps us uncover. The parts of ourselves we hide, not because they are evil, but because they are unaccepted. And when those parts go unexamined, they act out, not as our enemies, but as unhealed children. The dark psychology of cruelty reveals that hurt people often hurt people. But what it also reveals, when studied deeply, is that healed people help people. The same psychology that allows us to manipulate can be used to nurture. The same energy that once punished can be redirected toward protection. Agency is the hinge that turns cruelty into care. We are not prisoners of our impulses. Neuroscience confirms this. The human brain has the capacity for neuroplasticity, the ability to change, to rewire, to build new habits over time. Cruelty may have carved a path through your past, but that path is not destiny. And in society, this agency matters just as much. When systems recognize cruelty, not only as criminal, but as patterned and treatable, outcomes shift. Restorative justice programs, for example, have shown that empathy training, dialogue, and shared storytelling reduce repeat offenses far more effectively than punishment alone. Have you ever imagined what the world would feel like if every time someone acted cruelly, they were asked not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you? That question doesn't remove responsibility, it deepens it. It invites transformation. Because cruelty is not simply the presence of evil, it is the absence of clarity, connection, and choice. When people lose those things, they reach for control in the only ways they know how. But when they are given space to reflect, to understand, to be seen, they change. The dark psychology of cruelty gives us a map of the human mind at its most guarded, but that map is also an invitation, not to avoid the dark, but to walk through it with eyes open. You cannot change what you do not acknowledge, and you cannot heal what you continue to hide. So take this moment, not to judge your past, but to see it. See the moments when you used sharp words to defend soft feelings. See the times you stayed silent when you could have stood up. And then forgive, not to forget, but to move forward. Because when cruelty becomes conscious, it begins to lose its grip. And in that space, something else is born. Not just understanding, but grace. Cruelty does not always enter with screams. Sometimes it tiptoes in with excuses, with silence, with the soft voice that says, "This is normal." But cruelty, once seen clearly, cannot remain invisible. It reveals something, not only about the world, but about us, about the parts we silence, the emotions we deny, the power we misuse. The deeper truth behind dark psychology is not just that people hurt others, it is that they often do so believing they have no other option. Cruelty becomes a distorted form of expression, a desperate attempt to be noticed, to be right, to survive. And yet you are not bound by that story. You are not defined by your worst thoughts, or even your worst actions. You are defined by what you choose next. Every moment is a fork in the road. Have you asked yourself lately, what kind of impact do I leave behind in words, in silence, in the spaces between? The dark psychology of cruelty teaches us about harm, but it also teaches us about healing. The line between the two is not as wide as we think. It starts with reflection, with ownership, with the humility to say, "I've been both the victim and the perpetrator." That's not weakness, that's the first step toward wisdom. Because cruelty is not the end, it is a mirror. And when you dare to look into it, not with shame but with truth, you begin to see not just what's been broken, but what's still possible to rebuild.